The next two problems that are each worth 2 points ask you to identify the sort of definition offered in each of the passages below. And here, the definitions that we're interested in are those 5 definitions discussed in the chapter and in lecture. So a stipulative definition, a lexical definition, a precising definition, a persuasive definition, and a theoretical definition. Number 9 says the following. I, philosopher Nelson Goodman, define the predicate grew as all things examined before T, just in case they are green, to other things just in case they are blue. That's a definition offered on page 72 of the 1983 publication of Fact, Fiction, and Forecast, a book by Goodman. I think the best candidate from our 5 definition types for this definition is a stipulative definition. Grew is a word you've never heard before. Nelson Goodman seems to be in the context of this book saying, by grew I mean the following, stipulating the meaning of that predicate grew. I would probably also accept, because Goodman is in fact an academic philosopher, a theoretical definition, even though nothing in this definition is particularly theoretical or even particularly philosophical in its expression. Nevertheless, I would also accept that as reasonable. It's not a lexical definition because it's not being offered as the meaning of an ordinary term as used by regular people, and that should be pretty obvious from the nature of the definition and where it came from. Number 10, the World Health Organization defines overweight as having a body mass index BMI of 30 or above, where BMI is a person's weight divided by their height squared. I would probably say the best candidate from our 5 definitions as the characterization of this particular definition would be a precising definition. We already have an understanding of what the word overweight means. The World Health Organization is refining or making more precise what they mean by overweight for the purposes of the World Health Organization's policies, procedures, recommendations, and so on. And so it looks like they are refining a term that already has regular meaning for a specific use. I suppose I would also accept a theoretical definition if you suppose that body mass index would be a theoretical term understood by a specific measurement procedure. Our next set of problems are problems where you're given a passage and you're asked to decide, first of all, whether or not a fallacy has been committed, an informal fallacy. And if there is no informal fallacy, you're to write no fallacy. If you think there's an informal fallacy, you're to select one of the informal fallacy categories from this rather long list, right, that we covered in lecture, that was covered in the chapter, that best characterized the sort of fallacy that is committed in this passage. Each of these problems is worth 4 points. I gave 2 points for correctly deciding whether or not a fallacy was committed or not, and then I gave 2 points or some part thereof to reflect whether or not what kind of fallacy you characterized the argument as reflected an understanding of the kind of fallacy that you designated, and then finally whether or not I thought it was in fact the best characterization of the fallacy. So number 11 here is, I find it very disappointing that you're not discussing the fact that 93% of blacks in America are killed by other blacks. This was a statement made on Meet the Press in November 2014 by the former mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, in response to the discussion, the topic that had been raised about aggressive policing and incarceration of African Americans after the police shooting of Michael Brown Jr. in Ferguson, Missouri earlier that year. So the question is a fallacy being committed here? And I think definitely a fallacy is being committed here. The fallacy that I think best, or the category that best characterizes this fallacy, is a red herring. Giuliani is changing the topic. You want to talk about violence, incarceration, policing. I want to change it from whether or not police are acting in appropriate ways to what's killing Black Americans. So I want to change the topic away from a discussion about aggressive policing and incarceration of African Americans to something that is also about violence, also about African Americans, but not about policing. And so that would be a classic red herring, where you suddenly change the topic of discussion, something related, so that if you don't notice it, you won't realize that, hey, you're distracting me from what we were really talking about. Our next argument is number 12. Jaden is stronger than Noah. Noah is stronger than Mason. Therefore, Jaden is stronger than Mason. So this argument has two premises and a conclusion. The premises relate individuals in terms of is stronger than, and they exhibit what's called a transitive relation. So if Jaden is stronger than Noah, and then Noah is stronger than Mason, then Jaden must also be stronger than Mason. And that is a perfectly valid deductive argument. So there is no fallacy there. Our next passage. An extremely credible source has called my office and told me that Barack Obama's birth certificate is a fraud. And this was a tweet by Donald Trump on August 6, 2012. This, I think, is definitely a fallacy. I would probably characterize it as an appeal to unqualified authority. Saying someone is a credible source doesn't make them a credible source. If you don't have information with which to evaluate whether or not a source is credible, then I would suggest you are basing that argument or your consumption of that argument on an appeal to unqualified authority. Since Trump doesn't name the individual, you could also say that it was a case of suppressed evidence because relevant information has been withheld in the context of that argument. So I would accept either of those two possibilities.